This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Nearly everyone is undeniable. A more sensible objection to philosophy than that it is ineffectual is pretty much the opposite, that it is too dangerous. Nietzsche called a philosopher a terrible explosive from which nothing is safe, though he didn't mean that as an objection. But what this usually means is that any philosophy is dangerous, except the speaker's own, and what it amounts to is fear of what might happen if things change. It might occur to you that perhaps there are people who don't even think it worthwhile to enter into this discussion at all, however briefly, not even to support the sceptical stance that I have just mentioned. And you would be right. But that doesn't mean to say that they don't have a philosophy. Far from it. It may mean that they are not prepared to philosophize, to state their views and argue for them or discourse upon them. But it doesn't mean that they have no abiding values, nothing which they systematically regard as worthwhile. They might think, for instance, that real expertise at doing something is more desirable than any amount of theoretical knowledge. Their ideal would not so much be insight into the nature of reality as the capacity to become one with it in the execution of some particular activity, to have trained oneself to do something without conscious effort, as if by a perfectly honed natural instinct. I am not just making these people up. A lot of Zen Buddhist thought, or perhaps I should say Zen Buddhist practice, leans strongly in this direction. And this ideal of aiming at a certain kind of thoughtlessness was the outcome of a great deal of previous thinking. If philosophy is so close to us, why do so many people think that it is something very abstruse and rather weird? It isn't that they are simply wrong. Some philosophy is abstruse and weird, and a lot of the best philosophy is likely to seem abstruse or weird at first. That's because the best philosophy doesn't just come up with a few new facts that we can simply add to our stock of information, or a few new maxims to extend our list of do's and don'ts, but embodies a picture of the world and/or a set of values. And unless these happen to be yours already, remember that in a vague and unreflective way we all have them, it is bound to seem very peculiar. If it doesn't seem peculiar, you haven't understood it. Good philosophy expands your imagination. Some philosophy is close to us, whoever we are. Then, of course, some is further away, and some is further still, and some is very alien indeed. It would be disappointing if that were not so, because it would imply that human beings are intellectually rather monotonous. But there's no need to start at the deep end. We start at the shallow end, where, as I've said, we are all standing in the water already. We may be standing in the water, but why try to swim? In other words, what is philosophy for? There is far too much philosophy, composed under far too wide a range of conditions, for there to be a general answer to that question. But it can certainly be said that a great deal of philosophy has been intended as, understanding the words very broadly, a means to salvation, though what we are to understand by salvation, and salvation from what, has varied as widely as the philosophies themselves. A Buddhist will tell you that the purpose of philosophy is the relief of human suffering and the attainment of enlightenment. A Hindu will say something similar, if in slightly different terminology. Both will speak of escape from a supposed cycle of death and rebirth, in which one's moral deserts determine one's future forms. An Epicurean, if you can find one nowadays, will pooh-pooh all the stuff about rebirth, but offer you a recipe for maximizing pleasure and minimizing suffering in this your one and only life. Not all philosophy has sprung out of a need for a comprehensive way of living and dying, but most of the philosophy that has lasted has arisen from some pressing motivation or deeply felt belief. Seeking truth and wisdom purely for their own sakes may be a nice idea, but history suggests that a nice idea is pretty much all it is. Thus, Classical Indian philosophy represents the internal struggle between the schools of Hinduism and between them all and the Buddhists for intellectual supremacy. The battle for the preferred balance between human reason and scriptural revelation has been fought in many cultures, and in some is still going on. Thomas Hobbes's famous political theory, we shall be seeing more of it later, tries to teach us the lessons he felt had to be learnt in the aftermath of the English Civil War. Descartes and many of his contemporaries wanted medieval views, rooted nearly 2,000 years back in the work of Aristotle, to move aside and make room for a modern conception of science. Kant sought to advance the autonomy of the individual in the face of illiberal and autocratic regimes. Marx to liberate the working classes from poverty and drudgery. Feminists of all epochs to improve the status of women. None of these people were just solving little puzzles, though they did sometimes have to solve little puzzles on the way. They entered into debate in order to change the course of civilization. The reader will notice that I haven't made any attempt to define philosophy, but have just implied that it is an extremely broad term covering a very wide range of intellectual activities. Some think that nothing is to be gained from trying to define it. I can sympathize with that thought, since most attempts strike me as much too restrictive, and therefore harmful rather than helpful insofar as they have any effect at all. But I will at least have a shot at saying what philosophy is. Whether what I have to offer counts as a definition or not is something about which we needn't, indeed positively shouldn't, bother too much. Once, a very long time ago, our ancestors were animals, and simply did whatever came naturally without noticing that that was what they were doing, or indeed without noticing that they were doing anything at all. Then, somehow, they acquired the capacities to ask why things happen, as opposed to just registering that they do, and to look at themselves and their actions. That is not as big a jump as may at first sight appear. Starting to ask why things happen is in the first place only a matter of becoming a little more conscious of aspects of one's own behaviour. A hunting animal that follows a scent is acting as if aware that the scent is there because its prey has recently passed that way, and it is because that really is why the scent is there that it often succeeds in its hunt. Knowledge of this sort of connection can be very useful. It tells us what to expect. Furthermore, to know that A happens because B happened may improve your control over things. In some cases, B will be something that you can bring about, or prevent, which will be very useful if A is something you want, or want to avoid. Many of these connections animals, humans included, follow naturally and unconsciously, and the practice, once one is aware of it, can valuably be extended by consciously raising such questions in cases where we do not have conveniently built-in answers. There could be no guarantee, however, that this generally valuable tendency would always pay off, let alone always pay off quickly. Asking why fruit falls off a branch pretty soon leads one to shake the tree. Asking why it rains, or why it doesn't rain, takes us into a different league, especially when the real motive underlying the question is whether we can influence whether it rains or not. Often we can influence events, and it may well pay to develop the habit of asking, when things, a hunting expedition for example, have gone wrong, whether that was because we failed in our part of the performance, as opposed to being defeated by matters beyond our control. That same useful habit might have generated the thought that a drought is to some extent due to a failure of ours. And now, what failure? What have we done wrong? And then an idea might crop up, which served us well in our infancy. There are parents who do things for us that we can't do ourselves, but only if we've been good and they aren't cross with us. Might there be beings that decide whether the rain falls, and shouldn't we be trying to get on the right side of them? That is all it would take for human beings to be launched into the investigation of nature and belief in the supernatural. So, as their mental capacities developed, our ancestors found their power increasing, but they also found themselves confronted by options and mysteries. life raised a host of questions where previously it had simply been lived unquestioningly. It is just as well that all this happened gradually, but even so, it was